The frost cracked under his boots like tiny bones. Each step was a small, sharp protest in the pre-dawn silence of the stable yard. The air was a blade, sharp and clean, scented with old hay and the ghost of wood smoke. Inside the long barn, the darkness was softer, warmer, heavy with the breath of sleeping animals. For Eli, this was the only hour that felt bearable. The world hadn't yet begun to demand things from him. Here, in the hushed cathedral of the stable, he could just be a shape moving through the gloom. A man whose only job was to fill a feed bucket. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The question wasn't one he asked aloud. It was the drumbeat his heart had adopted, a dull, constant rhythm beneath everything he did. His brother, Matteo, was everywhere in this place, in the worn leather of the bridle hanging on a hook, in the specific way the light fell through the loft door, and most of all, in the last stall at the end of the row. The horse was Matteo's final, beautiful, complicated project, an Arabian stallion named Zephyr. Not a pet, not a companion. A creature of pure, distilled potential that Matteo had spoken of in whispers, his eyes alight with a kind of reverent fire. Eli had never understood it. He understood engines, concrete, things that stayed where you put them. He didn't understand this tempest in equine form. He approached the stall now, his movements slow, deliberate, unthreatening. It was a dance he'd learned through weary repetition. Zephyr was already awake, a sculpture of shadows and silver in the deep stall. He didn't startle. He just turned his head, the elegant arch of his neck a perfect curve against the dark wood. His ears were forward, twin satellites taking in every detail of Eli's approach. The dark, liquid eye that watched him was bottomless, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. Eli leaned the feed bucket against his leg and slid the bolt open. The metal clank was obscenely loud in the quiet. Zephyr's head lifted a fraction, his nostrils flaring as he sampled Eli's scent on the cold air. Hay, dust, grief. The horse took a single, mincing step back, putting more space between them. It was what he always did. A declaration. You may enter my kingdom, but do not come near the throne. Morning, Eli murmured, the word a cloud of steam in the air. He kept his voice low, a flat, even river of sound. He dumped the grain into the trough, the pellets rattling like hail. He moved to the water bucket, checking it was full, his movements economical, devoid of any unnecessary flourish. He was a function here, a caretaker, a ghost tending another ghost. He could feel the horse's gaze on him, a physical weight between his shoulder blades. It was a look that felt less like being seen and more like being assessed, measured against some invisible standard Eli could never hope to meet. Matteo's standard. Matteo, who could walk into this stall and have the great head lowered into his chest, who could laugh as Zephyr lipped at his pockets, searching for apple slices. That easy communion was a language Eli didn't speak. His brother was 6 months gone. A twist of metal on a rain-slicked highway. A phone call in the dead of night. The world had ended, and then the sun had come up, and Eli had inherited a house that echoed and a horse that watched him with the eyes of a judge. He finished his tasks and stood for a moment just watching Zephyr eat, the powerful jaws working, the soft snort of contentment. For a few minutes, the animal was just an animal, focused on its food, its guard down. The perfection of him was still startling. The dished face, the flaring nostrils, the tail held like A banner even at rest. He was everything Matteo had said he was, and he was a monument to a loss that felt too vast to contain. Eli's throat tightened. He turned to go, the familiar emptiness rushing in to fill the space where purpose had been. The ritual was over. He could go back to the quiet house, to the coffee that tasted like ash, to the long, stretching day. He slid the bolt back into place, the sound final. A period at the end of a sentence he never wanted to write. He took 2 steps down the gritty concrete aisle. And then he stopped. Soft sound behind him. Not a nicker, not a stomp. Just the quiet, deliberate shift of weight. The whisper of straw under a hoof. Eli turned. Zephyr had left his feed. He had come to the front of the stall. His head was over the Dutch door, his ears pricked forward. Not in alarm, but in attention. He was looking at Eli, really looking. The early morning light, pale and weak, caught in his dark eye. And for a breathtaking second, Eli didn't see a judge. He saw a question. He held his breath. He didn't move. The horse blew out a long, warm breath, a visible plume in the cold air. Then, with a slowness that felt ceremonial, he stretched his neck forward. His nose, velvety and soft, extended through the bars. He didn't reach for a pocket. He didn't snort or toss his head. He simply offered. Eli's heart was a frantic bird against his ribs. This was the line, the one Matteo had crossed with such ease, the one Eli had never dared to approach. Every instinct told him to stay still, to not break this fragile, impossible moment. Slowly, so slowly his joints ached with the care of it, he lifted his hand. His fingers, numb with cold, were trembling. He didn't reach. He just presented his curled fist, a neutral, non-threatening gesture he'd seen his brother make 100 times. Zephyr's nostrils flared, vacuuming up Eli's scent. The warm air puffed against his knuckles. The horse hesitated, his ear twitching back then forward again. A silent debate. Then he lowered his head that final, impossible inch. The touch was softer than anything Eli could have imagined. The skin of the horse's muzzle, like brushed velvet, pressed against his frozen fingers. It was warm, alive, a tiny, profound furnace of life in the freezing dawn. It was just a touch, a sniff, a connection so brief it could have been a trick of the light. Zephyr pulled back, his head lifting once more to its regal height. His gaze held Eli's for one more heartbeat. Then he turned and walked back into the shadows of his stall, to his unfinished breakfast, as if nothing of consequence had happened at all. Eli stood rooted to the spot, his hand still hanging in the air, the place where the horse had touched. Him tingled, a brand of warmth in the cold. The empty ache inside him didn't vanish. It was still there, vast and hollow. But for the first time since the police had come to his door, the silence in that hollow didn't feel entirely alone. Haitoi didn't know why the horse had done it. He didn't understand the shift in the air, the unspoken truce. But as he finally turned to walk back to the empty house, his steps were slower, his breath a little easier. And he knew, with a certainty that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, that he would be back out here long before the next feeding. Not because he had to be, but because for a single, fleeting moment, the storm inside the horse had stilled. And for a single, fleeting moment, the storm inside Eli had too. He didn't know why. When he reached the stable door and looked back into the deep gloom of the barn, The horse was standing at the front of his stall again, watching him leave. Quiet that followed that first touch wasn't peace. It was a truce, a fragile, wordless agreement between two creatures who shared the same wound but had no language to speak of it. Eli found himself in the barn more often. The tasks became less of a chore, more of a rhythm. Muck out the stall, fill the nets with sweet-smelling hay, curry the silver coat until it shone like moonlight on water. Zephyr allowed it all with a distant, regal tolerance, but he never repeated that first forward gesture. He was a king permitting a servant to tend him, his dark eyes always watching, always holding some unreadable thought. But then the little things began. It was the way Zephyr's ears would snap to attention, rotating like radar dishes every time. Eli spoke Mateo's name on the phone to a well-meaning relative. The way the horse would sometimes freeze, his whole body locking up, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line where Mateo used to ride him, as if waiting for a ghost to emerge from the pines. He'd let Eli run the brush over his neck, but when the rhythm was just right, a specific long stroke that Eli realized, with a jolt, was exactly how Mateo used to do it, the horse's eye would soften, and his lower lip would wiggle in a blissful, unconscious droop. Eli started to feel like an archaeologist of a life he'd only ever visited. He was piecing together his brother from the shards the horse was giving him. It was unsettling. This animal wasn't just a reminder. He was a living archive. And Eli, without meaning to, had become the sole researcher. The breaking point came on an afternoon thick with the promise of rain. The air was heavy, pressing down on the ranch, and the sky was a bruised purple. A nervous energy ran through the barn. The horses were restless, pacing their stalls, whinnying at the charged air. Zephyr was a coil of tension, his hooves dancing. On the straw, his head high and his nostrils flaring at the wind that whipped through the open doors. Eli was trying to steady him, talking in a low, calm voice that felt like a lie. His own nerves were frayed. The storm felt like an echo of the turmoil inside him, the grief that was never far from the surface. He reached into the tack room for a heavier blanket, and his hand brushed against an old, forgotten crate shoved high on a shelf. It tumbled down, scattering its contents across the floor. Old brushes, a broken headstall, a tube of fly spray, and a small, flat, wooden box. Eli's breath caught. He knew that box. Mateo had made it in high school woodshop. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he pried the rusted clasp open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, wasn't jewelry. It was a child's drawing, laminated to protect it. A stick figure with a wild scribble of black hair sat on a horse that was all legs and a big smile. Scrawled in crayon at the top were the words, "My brother Eli and me on Zephyr." He'd drawn it the weekend Mateo had first brought the young, skittish colt home. Eli, embarrassed, had scoffed at it. "I've never even been on him," he'd said. Mateo had just smiled that easy smile of his. "You will be," he'd said, tucking the drawing away. "I'm going to make a rider out of you yet." The memory was a physical blow. It wasn't a sad memory. It was a happy one. And that was somehow worse. It was a door to a future that had been permanently locked. The hope in his brother's voice, the silly, childish faith of that drawing, it was all just gone, snuffed out on a wet road. A sob tore out of Eli. It was a raw, ugly sound, ripped from a place so deep he didn't know he could access it. He crumpled onto the dusty floor of the tack room, the drawing pressed to his chest, his body shaking with the force of a grief he had been holding back for 6 months. He cried for his brother. He cried for the conversations they'd never have. He cried for the future that was stolen, for the empty house, for the unbearable silent weight of being left behind. He was lost in the storm of it, drowning in the pain. He didn't hear the soft nicker. He didn't see the shadow block the light from the door. Zephyr had pulled his head over the stall door. He was stretched out as far as he could, his neck elongated, his ears pricked forward not in alarm, but in intense focus. He whickered again, a low rumbling sound that was nothing like his usual high-spirited calls. Eli looked up, his vision blurred by tears. The great Arabian stallion was watching him. He wasn't restless anymore. The storm in the air, the electric tension that had him dancing minutes before, was forgotten. Every ounce of his being was focused on the man weeping on the floor. Then, Zephyr did something Eli had never seen him do. He lowered his head, not just a little. He dropped it down, bringing it level with Eli's own, and he let out a long, slow, deliberate breath. A warm, hay-scented sigh that washed over Eli's face. It was an unmistakable gesture. It was the way a horse soothes another horse in distress, a universal language of comfort. He stood there, his head low, his dark eyes soft, holding space for Eli's breaking point. He didn't move. He didn't demand anything. He just breathed. He stayed. He waited. He was an anchor in the raging sea of Eli's grief, a solid, warm, living presence that said, without words, I am here. I am here. You are not alone in this. And Eli understood. This wasn't just Mateo's horse. This was a creature who had loved his brother too. This was a being who also waited for a footsteps that would never come, who heard a voice that was now only a memory. Their grief was the same. They were the two halves of a whole that was missing its center. And in that dusty tack room, with the storm breaking outside, the last wall around Eli's heart shattered, and he reached out a shaking hand, not with a fist this time, but with open fingers, and he buried them in the silken fur of Zephyr's cheek. The horse leaned into the touch, his eye closing, and for a long, long time, man and horse simply stayed there, weathering the storm together. Weeks later, the first true signs of spring arrived. The willows by the creek were tinged with green, and the air lost its winter bite. The change on the ranch was quiet, but profound. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was contemplative. The chores were no longer a burden. They were a rhythm he shared. On one of those soft, golden evenings, Eli turned Zephyr out into the big paddock. He watched the horse explode into a joyful gallop, kicking up his heels, celebrating his freedom and the feel of the warm earth under his hooves. He ran not like a creature escaping, but like one truly, wholly alive. After his initial burst of energy, Zephyr didn't just graze. He trotted to the far corner of the field, to a spot under the old oak tree where the grass grew, long and thick. He dropped his head and began nosing at something in the weeds, not to eat, but to investigate. He looked back at Eli, who was leaning on the fence, and gave a short, impatient snort. Curious, Eli unlatched the gate and walked across the field. Zephyr waited for him, pawing gently at the ground. There, nestled in the roots of the oak, was a single determined dandelion that had gone to seed. It was a perfect, fragile white globe. Zephyr nudged it with his nose. The seeds took flight. Dozens of them, each a tiny parachute, caught the evening breeze and sailed into the golden light. They swirled around man and horse, a constellation of wishes taking flight. Eli felt a smile touch his lips, the first real one in a long, long time. It wasn't a happy smile, not exactly. It was something deeper. It was acceptance. It was the understanding that life was brutal and beautiful. In equal measure that love didn't die, it just changed shape. It became a memory. It became a breath of warm air on a cold day. It became a horse, leading you to a field to watch the seeds fly. Mateo was gone, but he had left behind a keeper of his spirit. Not a ghost, but a guide. A magnificent, storm-hearted creature who had, in the end, taught Eli how to stand in the rain and not be swept away. Sometimes, the ones who carry you through the storm are the ones no one else saw coming. If this story found a home in your heart, then you know these moments of connection are what make us human. If you want to be here for the next story that just might change your heart, then do us a kindness. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment down below and tell us what you felt. And most importantly, press that bell icon so you won't miss a single one of our daily journeys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.